The potato and its migration from South America to Europe provides a useful lens for thinking about food sovereignty and the history of empires. By following the story of the potato, I hope to show how ideas about agriculture and food are entangled with the emergence of capitalism and its celebration of the free market. I will cook Boxty from a recipe I got online. Where else? Michael Pollan speaks of the cooking paradox. The more distanced our relationship with food, the more we're drawn to reading cookery books and blogs and watching food programs like this. He argues that perhaps one of the reasons behind this is that there are things about cooking we really miss. Cooking strikes deep emotional chords. It is, argues Claude Levi-Strauss, the act with which culture begins. I will cook and speak and present a dish made from potatoes in order to connect with a food that was being eaten in the Americas some 12,000 years ago and think about what it might teach us today. Evidence of domesticated potatoes in South America first appear around 7,800 BCE. From 5 wild parent plants, more than 2,800 types of cultivated potato are known to have originated. This biological diversity is attributed to the value Andean peoples place on their agricultural traditions. In the plains of the Altiplano, a technique of freeze-drying potatoes, both as food security and as an easily traded commodity, was developed. The dried potato is light and keeps well. It's been found in archaeological sites at Tiwanaku dating back 2,200 years. Called chuño, the tubers are frozen at night, warmed in the sun and trampled to squeeze out any residual water. Weather forecasting is critical to production. A particular luminous glow around the Pleiades in June is used to predict the size of the crop. If stars appear dim, planting is delayed. The flow of the wind, the behavior of birds, the spinning of spider webs, the colour of the sunsets all speak to whether the frost will be strong enough to effectively dry the potatoes. The Aymara language has as many words for frost as Irish has for rain. White chuño has been soaked in running water for up to 3 weeks and then left to dry on fields in the sun for 5 to 10 days, forming a white crust. The black chuño is not processed this way and has a far stronger flavour. Both are still used today. When the Inca came into power, they built vast storerooms for chuño and maize, collected as part of their taxation system. And this was redistributed to the people in times of food scarcity. When the Inca kingdom was conquered by the Spanish, they continued to encourage potato cultivation, recognizing its importance as the local staple food. With the discovery in 1546 of rich deposits of silver ore in Potosi, Bolivia, the Spanish impressed tens of thousands of indigenous people to mine the ore. The stores of chuño, security in times of scarcity, were then monetized. In a contemporary account, an author describes how many Spaniards have enriched themselves and returned prosperous to Spain by merely taking chuños to sell at the mines of Potosi, where food for the thousands of workers was always in demand. High mortality rates amongst indigenous miners meant labour became scarce, and African slaves were imported to work the mines. They were less able to withstand the altitude and working conditions. Famine, ill treatment, European diseases and mercury poisoning led to the death of an estimated 8 million people until the silver was depleted. Between 1556 and 1783, more than 40,800 metric tons of silver was extracted, much of it shipped to the Spanish monarchy. For the Inca and then the Spanish, chuño was the principal fuel of empire. The potato arrived in Europe during the transition from what was an essentially feudal economic order to a capitalist mode of production, involving the enclosure and privatization of common lands. Botanist Caspar Bauhin named it Solanum tuberosum esculentum, correctly identifying it as part of the nightshade family. He speculated that the potatoes caused wind and leprosy and incited Venus, a characterization that led to folkloric names such as Eve's apple or Earth's testicles. It was said that the potato was largely ignored by superstitious peasants in Europe, fearful of the underground tuber. Ireland was an exception. However, Rebecca Earls disputes this. Her research into botanical herbals, published in the 1850s, found references to potatoes growing in cottage gardens from Italy to Belgium. She says it was a vernacular fund of agricultural knowledge about potatoes. The popularity of the potato was increased as it was less vulnerable to natural disasters and climate events. And because it was grown and stored underground, it was less likely to be looted and burned in times of war. An advantage understood by Frederick the Great, who commanded that potatoes be grown as a hedge against famine. In France, the popularization of the potato is generally attributed to a French pharmacist, A. Parmentier, who had been a German prisoner of war in the 1850s and fed a diet of potatoes. His good health on his release convinced him of the value of the tuber as an Enlightenment superfood. Through academic and scientific research, pamphlets, treatises and cultural tactics, experiments that combined food, science, economics and medicine, Parmentier changed cultural attitudes to the potato in France. He was by no means unique in his efforts, but rather reflected pan-European ideas that emerged in the 18th century, with new models of political economy and governance that stressed the importance of a healthy, well-nourished population to the power and wealth of the state. The potato's arrival in Ireland is credited, by some, to tubers washed ashore from the wreck of the Spanish Armada. Others argue it travelled in the pockets of Basque sailors who traded along the western coast. Whatever the origin, it's not so surprising that Ireland was the first European country to accept the potato as a field crop, coming as it did on the heels of mass seizures of land, the plantations, and its re-territorialisation by settlers. The superior yield of calories per unit of land made subsistence possible for those dispossessed of land and gleaning rights, and the crop soon became part of the staple diet. The potato was supremely adaptable to the Irish climate, growing in bogs, mountainsides and marginal lands too poor to sustain conventional crops. Cultivated with alloy, a tool that mirrors the tacala used in the Andes, the lazy bed or potato ridge system of cultivation was a highly effective, innovative technological development that evolved in response to pressure to use difficult-to-access land of no economic value on which to grow the food. Nally and Kearns point out that this subsistence sector, able to survive on the bare minimum, supplied foreign markets with their provisions, middlemen with their rack rents and landowners with cheap, abundant labour. Rapid population growth led to an increasing dependence on high-yield varieties like the lumper that were more vulnerable to diseases, eliciting dire predictions of calamity, most notoriously from Thomas Malthus. Having created an economic structure that facilitated the people's dependence on the potato. When the potato blight caused a catastrophic crop failure, forcing people into workhouses, it allowed the clearance of small holdings and a shift to more profitable forms of agricultural production. Charles Wood and Charles Trevelyan were the leading advocates of colonial ideology in Ireland and oversaw the systematic dehumanization of a culture dependent on a degenerate potato diet. Trevelyan saw the destitute poor as economically redundant, their poverty either a natural phenomenon that they had miserably failed to overcome, or divine providence to aid a move to a more efficient, capitalist form of agriculture. Far from regretting his steadfast refusal to alleviate Irish poverty, Trevelyan relished the lessons that 1 million deaths could offer later to the British imperial project in India. Writing in 1880 about attempts by the starving Irish to stop the export of food, he noted, "At the commencement of the Irish famine, there was the same popular desire to prohibit the export of grain, but it was successfully resisted." The bald statistics of over 1 million dead and 2 million dispersed around the world should more accurately be called a man-made disaster. It could have been prevented or mitigated by timely emergency relief on the part of the British and the Irish landowners and agents who profited from the subsequent land divisions. Trevelyan and his government colleagues saw large-scale famine and death in Ireland as a shortcut to modernity. Irish small farmers and cottiers, human encumbrances, blocking the way to a more efficient and profitable capitalist system of agriculture. Political violence, which Nally defines as the interaction between cognitive designs and human decisions, allowed the disaster to be viewed as an instrument of cure, a form of social prophylaxis that would finally regenerate what was perceived to be a diseased body politic. In 19th century Europe, as urbanization and industrialization took hold, so too did advances in nutrition and food science, changing attitudes once again to the potato. No longer perceived as the saviour plant of the 17th and 18th century, its popularity with workers was blamed for lacklustre economic growth due to the impact of lazy potato blood on the working body. The threat the potato posed to the expansion of the free market would, Malthus argued, constitute the most cruel and fatal blow to the happiness of the lower classes of people in this country that they had ever received. Even German radicals believed potato blood weakened the people and delayed the revolution. Still, as a cheap, easily grown, nutritious food, the potato fed a rapidly growing workforce, driving the industrial engine that consolidated power in Europe until the middle of the 20th century. In Ireland, however, the potato cannot easily be disentangled from the trauma of the famine. Its history has been mobilised for political and ideological reasons. Gerry Adams's frequent use of most oppressed people ever, MOPE, to claim that the Irish were more ill-treated than any people at any time in history, and is a tendency that's been shared by the Irish state. It was used to justify the passive acceptance of the inequalities and injustices imposed by the IMF after the 2008 crash. Fintan O'Toole called it out. National freedom, he argues, isn't another word for nothing left to lose. It's another word for no one left to blame. No one, that is, except yourself. There's a deep and abiding satisfaction in imagining how wonderful you'd be if only those foreign bastards would let you. Being free means having to live with the dawning realization that you might not be so wonderful after all. This Boxty, made with the potato that helped birth the values that came into being through colonial violence, is seared with mope. It's a reminder of the need to digest the oppression and reflect on the migrations and displacements caused by neoliberal economic policies and climate change today. It's a public rejection of the values that came into being with empire building. An aid memoir to Indigenous farming knowledge and the awareness of soil, land and climate that's deeply relevant now in the age of the Anthropocene. Can we not digest our oppression, engage with the future, and embrace our freedom with all its attendant responsibilities to all of the inhabitants of the earth?